Made possible through support from ARC Thrift Stores, Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council, Developmental Pathways, and the ARC of Aurora. A THINK+change training. Hello, thank you so much for tuning in for a episode within our multi-part series talking about substance abuse and people with developmental disabilities and really addressing kind of what those systemic gaps are. My name is Erica Dennison and I will be your host. And today's episode is our first episode within this multi-part series where I have a special guest from our community where we're really going to be able to dive in to help you have a better understanding of really what is substance abuse, to give you a primer and all that good stuff. So as we kind of dive in, might you introduce yourself, a little bit about who you are, what you do? That would be terrific.
Sure. Thanks, Erica. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for
My
being
name is
here.
Ann Noonan, and I have been in the field of substance use disorder for almost 40 years now.
Wow.
Started out specifically in addiction, then realized the overlap with mental health, mental wellness, and then my current crusade basically is to really look at whole person health, where it's addiction, mental health, and physical health. And then, of course, the underpinnings of all that are social determinants of health, which your population, the population IDD has lots of needs just to have stable lives and support for living a good life.
Absolutely.
So all those fit together really well.
I appreciate your introduction. In addition to your very long-standing commitment to the field, 40 years is a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, you know your stuff, I would say, probably.
Well, let's hope so. I will say it's never been boring because we learn so much more every year, every month. There's more research, there's more strategies, there's more interventions. And so I've never been bored because something always is changing. I'm
sure. Well, thank you very much for being here today for our first episode within our multi-part series. So appreciate your introduction. As we're kind of diving into this first episode, might you share a little bit about what is addiction and substance abuse disorders? Here and after, you might hear it referred to as SUD.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point. We used to talk about alcoholism and drug addiction and use the term addiction a lot, and we use the term alcoholic and addict a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're really trying to broaden those concepts to talk about substance use disorders. And there's a whole spectrum of them. The terms that we used before implied that you either were or you weren't. You either were an alcoholic or you weren't. And what we know now is that there's a whole spectrum of problems with substances and even almost healthy use or lower risk use on a continuum. And talking about it in that way actually opens up more folks to look at what their patterns are with drinking and drugging, as opposed to, if I ever tell my primary care doc I'm worried about drinking too much wine at night, they're going to send me to a 30-day rehab. So really trying to open it up to looking at different gradations of problems and different kinds of interventions depending on what the problem looks like.
Interesting. I mean, everyone's journey is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Sure.
So what makes certain substances more addictive than others? For example, I am a diehard 2 cups of coffee person every morning, so I need my caffeine fix. So why can I have kind of a caffeine addiction, but I probably won't get an addiction to like my daily morning vitamin?
Well, let me stop you there because I would not call your caffeine use addiction unless it met some other criteria. So you use caffeine every day, and maybe if you don't have your caffeine, you get a headache or you feel kind of grumpy.
Mm-hmm.
That means that you're physically dependent on caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're looking at in a fuller blown substance use disorder is other factors. So if you're robbing liquor stores to get your coffee or knocking over the corner Starbucks, that's a negative consequence that's associated with your use. You're having negative consequences. You're spending more and more of your time drinking coffee. You're not seeing your friends because you're so busy drinking coffee. See what I mean?
Yeah,
So there's a
exactly.
lot of other things associated. We can be physically dependent, for example, on insulin or perhaps an antidepressant that are helpful to the way we live, and you could um, define it as being an addiction, but it doesn't have the other criteria that we really look at when we're talking about it as a disorder.
Got it.
And then you said, well, why some substances and not others? A lot of it we are still researching, but we know that some drugs, alcohol, have different effects on our brains. So if you think about something like opiates, we have one kind of receptor in our brain that is set up for opiates. If you take an opiate, it zooms right there to those brain receptors. Nowhere else. It goes right there.
Got it.
So the addiction there can be pretty quick because you're blocking those receptors with the outside material opiates, and then the rest of your brain kind of stops producing. We have opioid-like things in our brain anyway. So you develop that dependency really quickly. Amphetamines are a similar kind of thing. They rocket in your brain. They disrupt a lot of your normal brain functioning. Alcohol also, it's kind of like pouring paint on the wall. It kind of goes in all the crooks and crannies in your brain. So each of those drugs has a slightly different brain impact. And then you also look at what are some genetic predispositions, some genetic vulnerabilities. If I have a family history of alcoholism or addiction, my brain is just set up differently. We don't understand that totally, but we have a lot of twin studies, and we can look at family histories, and you can pretty clearly see lines through family trees where addiction exists. That doesn't mean that folks without that genetic predisposition can't become addicted, because what we're looking at is not only the substance, but we're looking at using the substance, so exposure, and then how long that exposure happens, what's the setting. So let's say you have a couple guys that go into the Marines. One came from an alcoholic family, one didn't. But as they go through boot camp, they're both drinking like crazy. Well, the non-genetically preloaded Marine may be exposing themselves to so much alcohol that they start developing the whole spectrum of addiction as well. So it's kind of a multifactorial, right? We really can't sort it out necessarily. But each drug has its own profile. We tend to watch trends with drugs. Like right now, we're very concerned about opiates, and methamphetamines are really coming in. It's like, wow, this is really taking us down. And those kinds of trends can come and go. But addiction itself, the dependence itself, is pretty similar across all those.
Interesting. And even like when you were talking about this is very educational for me also, because my bread and butter is developmental disability. When we're talking about these blended identities of someone who also has some types of substance abuse disorder, this is a very new world for me. So hearing you talk about how, depending on what it is, whether it be alcohol or, the opioids and how it just impacts the brain differently is a very, very interesting and, educational for sure. I mean, because I don't think a lot of people know that.
Well, and I use the example of the Marines at boot camp, but let's take an IDD person, two of them, one who has a genetic predisposition, one that doesn't, but the exposure to the drugs might be very similar. So what we see in a lot of folks with IDD population, they want to connect, they want to be with other people, kind of social drift. They end up with people that are using drugs and alcohol who accept them maybe more easily than in other populations. And to go along and get along, they may start using drugs. They may be taken advantage of by other folks that are using drugs, but at the same time, they have that feeling of belonging. So over time, with exposure to the drug, they may end up becoming physically and psychologically dependent, or they may not. It may be that the substance itself is sort of secondary to the consequences that are coming because of the social setting.
Well, even when you were talking about how, they're going to get in with the crowd that may not be best suited, right, for them. But the idea that you're talking about, like, they may become a victim, and kind of be around the wrong people. I mean, we often talk about here within our work that people with disabilities are at significantly higher rates of being a victim of a crime. So talking about if they also are using in some way, shape, or form, it certainly can impact that victimization piece, which I don't know if a lot of people think about or consider.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your feedback on that. I really appreciate your long-standing time in working within this field to answer that question. What would you say the line between recreational use and addiction may be?
Well, I think we sort of alluded to it in that there's a continuum of harm. There's a continuum of high-risk behavior versus low-risk behavior. And so when you look at various profiles of each drug, each one has its own risk and consequence profile. Alcohol is the most damaging drug that we use, even more so than opiates or methamphetamine in terms of personal impact on family and friends, and social impact. And we put a lot of press on the drugs, but some of the drugs are actually less harmful in the long run. So what you see is folks that there's like healthier drinking, for example. If you go to your doctor's office these days, they'll ask you how many drinks a day you have, how many drinks a week, things like that. And what they're looking for is a baseline of exposure and harm that you're risking. So one of the things we do now is help people look at, maybe you're drinking 3 or 4 glasses of wine 2 or 3 or 4 times a week. What would it look like if you backed off and only drank twice a week and only had 2 glasses of wine each time? So that would be, I think we would consider that more recreational. They don't necessarily have other consequences, but they're setting themselves up for longer term physical health consequences. So again, looking at that continuum of harm.
Got it.
And so recreational use would be use that was not impacting other areas of my life, not impacting my health, my job, things like that.
Interesting. I think that, whenever we go to the doctor and answer that question, I think there's always this thought that maybe you shouldn't be sharing the whole truth because you don't want to be judged.
Right.
But it's really like about breaking down the stigma of what are your actions doing, then how is it impacting your health?
That's right. And actually, most people don't drink at harmful levels. And a very high percentage of folks don't drink alcohol at all or have champagne at New Year's or something like that.
Sure.
And then the folks with the most serious alcohol problems don't even know how to lie to the doctor. They'll say, oh, yeah, I only drink a 6-pack, a night.
Yeah.
Not really even, that seems normal to them. Or
Sure.
that's what social drinking might be, because their perspective is so off kilter. So it's trying to break it down to, as I said, just because you're drinking, if you talk about even having, sleep problems or anxiety or whatever, your doctor is not necessarily going to say you need to go to a 30-day rehab and never drink again. But that's the image that we have of if I have an alcohol problem, I either have one or I don't. And if I do have one, I'm going to be sitting in church basements for the rest of my life, talking about my feelings.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of other options than that.
Well, and I think also, as you're talking about, I've never lived it, right? It's all about lived experience. And so when you're talking about going to, I'm assuming Alcoholics Anonymous, right, in the church basement, it really has worked for a lot of people. I personally know folks who have gone through it and has been successful, but then for others it hasn't.
Right.
Alternatively, the impacts that you're talking about on, a few minutes ago you talked about like the impacts on family and the relationships. There's also, I think it's called Al-Anon, right?
Right,
and
for friends and family.
For friends and family who have a loved one who is going through, that type of trouble.
Right,
so sounds like groups are out there to help, but maybe it's not always the best fit.
Well, I think that's a really important point. So AA, Al-Anon work really well for certain people. And we also have to see what people want to do and what they're comfortable with and what kind of changes they're willing to make. And am I more comfortable talking to my doctor and maybe keeping a diary of how much I'm drinking versus saying I'm an alcoholic and I must go to these meetings. There's a lot of other interventions, and a lot of it starts with looking at how much are you using, what are the reasons that you're using, and then how can we start doing interventions around that so that you have other coping skills. I mean, what it really comes down to is folks at the far end of a substance use disorder only have one tool in the toolbox, and that's their use of drugs or alcohol. And what we want to do is help folks develop other skills, other tools. So with our IDD population, here the intervention might be other social settings or learning how to turn down drugs or alcohol when they're offered, refusal skills, how to be assertive in difficult situations. And that might be sufficient to help someone not go on to develop a full-blown substance use disorder.
Absolutely. That's great feedback, actually. I mean, as you're talking, I think about how there's so many barriers for the folks that we work with who have intellectual or developmental disabilities when it comes to like healthcare or public health access. And there's so many barriers when it comes to like, there's like attitude barriers where, people perceive, certain ways in which they think maybe someone with an IDD lives their life and, or maybe it's not the best quality of life, or there's communication barriers, obviously, where they may assume that someone with an IDD is just because they're unable to maybe communicate the same way you and I are, that maybe it's not worthwhile sharing all the information with them. Physical barriers, social barriers. I mean, there's a lot. And so I appreciate you, talking about people with IDD in this context, because there's a lot more that we can do, I think, to better support them with getting access and breaking down that stigma, because this is the reality for a lot of folks that we work with that who have IDD is they do have some type of substance abuse disorder. It's not all of them, but there's a handful of folks that we've worked with within our work, and that's the whole reason we want to start having this conversation.
Well, and I don't want to downplay that a certain percentage of these folks' refusal skills is not going to be sufficient, right? They have a full-blown physical dependence. They have the behaviors where they've lost other coping skills and so forth. And for them, they may need a more intensive intervention that's specifically aimed at the drug and alcohol use. But there's as we're talking about, there's a long spectrum of folks and the different kinds of problems that they have. But talk therapy in a group of 12 people may or may not be the right intervention.
Yeah, right. Very individualized is probably the best way to go.
Right.
Whether you do or do not have an IDD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that you mentioned public health. I mean, public health information really is a key to helping people make better decisions. Providing good information, providing education, helping people make their own choices. And not being super confrontive about things. I mean, if somebody tells me, you're overweight, stop eating so much, I'm like, whatever.
I'm living my life.
I'm living life, right? But if my doctor says, hey, if your BMI moved from 31 to 30, you'd have some health improvements. And that's the kind of intervention that we're trying to get folks to do with other drugs and alcohol. And clearly there are the far ends of injecting drugs, using in really dangerous places. You're going to want to have a more intensive intervention. But just to really keep in mind that there is a whole range of problems and a whole range of intervention that are available.
Perfect. Thank you for that information. I appreciate it. Would you say that there are some people who are more prone to addictions than others, and why is that? You talked a little bit about the genetic piece of things earlier, as well as maybe there's a social component. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Sure. Some of it's, I talked earlier about exposure. So obviously if you don't ever use a drug, you're not going to become addicted to it. So We have some profiles of what drugs cause the most addiction more quickly, and actually nicotine is one of the top ones in that list. It's also the route of administration and the speed. So taking a gummy with marijuana is much slower than injecting methamphetamine, for example. And so that quick hit, the quick reinforcement of using the drug tends to develop addiction more quickly. So you get into that really fast, I have the craving, I use the drug, I automatically instantly have the response. That's a more powerful reinforcer than some other ways that we use drugs. So that's one of the things we look at. Again, each drug has its own profile of its addiction potential and then the ways that it's used. And it, like I said, it's very complicated.
It
so
is very complicated.
You really have to try to think it through with folks and get their diary, get their understanding of when they use and how they use and what are the consequences. And also, as we were talking about with the IDD population, what are the positives of using? You know, that people don't do things for no good reason. People do things because they get some sort of pleasure or reward for it. What we say with addiction is you get the quick reward but long consequences, long-term consequences. But to help people look at, it gives me a social life. I'm bored, and I'm not as bored. You know, so trying to help people look at both sides of the equation, not just this drug is bad, but this drug does this. Are there other ways I could have those needs met?
Interesting. I mean, the spin you just put on it made me kind of go, whoa, right? I mean, the side of it was it's like a social thing, or I'm bored. I mean, I think it also could help with not helping, but it would help within the circle of supports of who help people with developmental disabilities, help them better understand, you know, what are the other alternatives that person could be doing. Are you bored because you don't have a job and you're able to work and you want to work, or are you looking to join a social club? Or, I mean, there's so many other ways in which I think the circle of supports in someone's life who has an IDD can help them figure out a healthier path.
Right.
We always say that we want to respect people's dignity of risk here, which basically means they have the right to make that decision and that choice, even if we don't always agree with it. But it's a learning moment for people. The hope is that we all learn from maybe mistakes that we make.
Right. Well, and the reality is most people recover or change their behavior in natural ways. Not everybody gets treatment. Most people don't get treatment. And so what we see is replacing the addiction with community, replacing the addiction with other positive experiences, helping folks have a goal that they're trying to reach that the use of substance is interfering with. Those are the kind of changes in kind of a more organic way that can help move people away from problematic use.
Interesting. And everything you shared today was just so helpful. I don't have any more formal questions for you. Do you have anything else to add? Any closing last minute thoughts kind of to help wrap up our conversation?
I think what I would encourage people to do is not stop your investigation at the stigma piece, and not stop at they have a drug problem or they have an alcohol problem, and the only thing we can do is remove them from their community and preach to them for 30 days. Just to really think about there's such a wide range of use patterns, and recovery looks very different for every person, and we add a lot of stigma and judgment to the use of drugs and alcohol. To instead think of it as, in terms of public health, it's a behavior that most people experience at least sometime in their lifetime, and some of us get in more trouble with it than others, and to back off from the judgment about that. I think that makes the biggest difference. And for friends and family, to try not to be so fearful and worried, because there are options and there is a lot of support out there. If you look maybe in different places than you might think you could look. You know, AA is a wonderful program. It's not the only program.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
There's a lot out there. And just one of the things with IDD is we do a lot of behavioral training and intervention and helping people make decisions and learn new habits, and to think of using those same skills in this area, I think would be really helpful.
That's great advice. I appreciate the hot tip. Well, Anne, I really appreciate your valuable time for joining us here today for our first episode within this multi-part series. So for any of you tuning in, be sure to tune into our next few episodes to help better understand this issue as we kind of help break the stigma and helping people with developmental and other disabilities who are facing this within their lives and with their families. So till next time, we'll see ya and stay curious. Take care.
Thank you.